Imagine standing completely alone in the center of basically the wealthiest, most militarily advanced empire on Earth.
Right, a total superpower.
Yeah, exactly. And you hold the mathematical proof that their entire economy is just a pyramid scheme, like it's destined to collapse.
Hmm.
So you present the data to the ruling class. You show them exactly how their systemic exploitation is mathematically unsustainable. And their response, they don't check your math.
No, of course they don't.
Right. They don't debate your spreadsheets. They just lock you up in a psychiatric ward.
It's the ultimate defense mechanism of power.
Yeah.
Like when you cannot defeat the logic of a reformer, you just destroy their credibility. You pathologize their sanity.
Right. Well, welcome to this deep dive, everyone. Today, we are undertaking, honestly, a massive mission. We're decoding one of the most powerful, intellectually defiant narratives in ancient literature.
We're looking at the conclusion of the Prophet Hud narrative, specifically in Surah Hud, Ayat 54 through 60.
But I want to say right up front, if you are expecting a traditional mystical story about a booming voice from the clouds and some magical smiting of a tribe, you kind of need to leave that at the door right now.
Yeah, we were completely throwing that out. We're looking at these verses through a totally different paradigm today. We're using what's called a scientifically grounded Parwezian interpretation.
Which, to break that down for you listening, it means we are stripping away the centuries of supernatural gloss, really, that typically coats these ancient texts.
Exactly. The Parwezian framework approaches this material not as, a collection of mythical bedtime stories, but as a textbook of social physics.
Social physics, I love that term.
It's so accurate, though. It treats the universe as an unbending system of cause and effect. Civilizations don't just collapse because the universe was having a bad day, right? Or some random roll of dice.
Right. They are violently recycled by history when they fail to produce value for humanity.
Precisely. And that concept, this social physics, is really what we are going to interrogate today. Like, how do the laws of human society actually mirror the laws of thermodynamics or gravity?
And to do that, we are looking at the nation of Ad. And let's just be really clear about who the Ad were, because they weren't just some primitive tribe wandering out in the desert.
Oh, not at all. They were a deeply advanced, deeply arrogant society. I mean, they had massive architectural achievements.
Yeah, towering pillars.
Yes, towering pillars that just dominated the landscape. But underneath all that, they had a deeply entrenched, utterly ruthless class system. They were the absolute global superpower of their era.
So they basically represented the absolute pinnacle of material success, but it was all built on this foundation of systemic inequality.
Which is exactly why the text details a very specific tactic this empire used when confronted with the truth. And we see this starting right there on Ayat 54.
Right. So enter Hud. One individual, just one guy standing before this monolithic power structure, and he starts, pointing out the rot in their foundation.
He essentially tells them that their whole society is built on the exploitation of the weak, that they're hoarding all this wealth at the top.
And that their entire system, which, by the way, the text refers to metaphorically as their gods, is violating the fundamental mathematical laws of human equity.
And the elite establishment's response here is incredibly telling. In Ayat 54, the elites of Ad look at Hud and say, "Our gods have gripped you with evil."
Which, in their idiom at the time, basically meant, you have been struck with insanity.
Yes, they are literally claiming his mind has been completely broken just because he dared to speak against their deities.
I really want to sit with this for a minute because the psychology of this is just fascinating. And frankly, it's incredibly modern.
Oh, it happens every day.
It does. Think about the massive, untouchable economic gods of our current era. Think about, mega corporations or deeply entrenched financial systems or corrupt political machines.
The powers that be.
Exactly. When a whistleblower steps up today and says, look, this supply chain is exploiting millions of people and destroying the ecosystem, and here is the data, the powers that be almost never actually engage with the data.
No, they don't hold a press conference to debate the nuances of the whistleblower's findings. That would validate them.
Right. Instead, the reformer is just dismissed as radical or unrealistic, utopian, or literally just mentally unstable.
Because you have to remember, the Ad's gods weren't just inanimate statues of stone or wood sitting in a temple somewhere. Those idols were symbols.
Symbols of what, exactly?
They represented the vested interests, the status quo, and the absolute economic monopolies of the elite class. The system of worship was inextricably linked to their system of social control.
So an attack on the temple is really just an attack on the central bank.
Completely. I mean, Hud wasn't just offending their religious sensibilities, he was threatening their profit margins. He presented them with totally rational arguments based on the cause and effect of their societal structure.
But you can't logically defend a system that mathematically oppresses, what, 99% of the population to enrich the top 1%.
Especially when someone is pointing out that structural math on a public stage. So, to protect their power, the elites deploy cognitive dissonance. If the messenger is crazy, well, then the message is null and void.
It's just character assassination utilized as a corporate defense policy.
Exactly.
They are looking at the public and saying, look at poor Hud. He spoke out against our flawless free market system, and his brain simply couldn't handle it. He's lost his grip on reality.
And this happens whenever a society becomes deeply, deeply entrenched in a paradigm of exploitation. The dominant paradigm, no matter how toxic it is, becomes classified as common sense.
Right? The new normal.
Yeah. And anything outside of that paradigm is framed as a mental defect. The elites of Ad are looking at a man proposing a society based on equitable distribution and universal justice.
And to them, that's insane.
To a society built entirely on ruthless hierarchy and domination, the concept of equality literally looks like madness. It just doesn't compute in their worldview.
Which brings us to the real crux of the conflict here. Because how does a solitary reformer even respond to this?
It's the ultimate test.
Yeah. When the entire establishment, backed by all the wealth, the media control, the military might of the known world, looks at you and diagnoses you as clinically insane, what do? You don't have an army. You don't have a PR firm.
Well, if you are operating purely on a political or tactical level, you might try to backtrack. You might try to negotiate some kind of truce.
Right, soften the message a bit.
But Hud delivers an absolute masterclass in intellectual defiance here. He doesn't cower, and he certainly doesn't try to find a middle ground with corruption. He just calls their bluff entirely.
Yeah, moving into the second half of Ayat 54 and into Ayat 55, his response is staggering. He takes the universal law as his witness and declares that he is entirely free from their shirk.
And just to clarify that term, within this Parwezian framework, shirk isn't just bowing to a statue.
Right, it's bigger than that.
It means associating partners with the ultimate authority. So essentially, participating in their corrupt, divided socioeconomic system where elites play God over the vulnerable. He disavows their entire system.
And then in Ayat 55, he just drops this monumental challenge. He says, scheme against me, all of you together, and give me no respite.
Give me no respite. I mean, he is standing completely alone. He has zero physical protection, yet he tells an empire to bring it on.
Do your absolute worst.
Yeah, do your worst and do it right now. I will not accept a temporary ceasefire. I will not compromise an inch of this truth.
See, I have to stop here and push back on this a little bit because, structurally speaking, isn't it reckless?
How so?
Well, if you are a solitary reformer and you actually want to affect real change, shouldn't you play the political game? You know, reform from within. Make a few concessions just to stay alive so you can keep fighting tomorrow.
A lot of people think that way, sure.
By saying scheme against me altogether, it seems like he is just asking to be crushed by the machine. It feels like, I don't know, emotional bravado, like a martyr complex.
That is definitely the natural reaction if you view power only in terms of physical force or like political leverage. But the framework we are applying here argues forcefully that Hud's stance has absolutely nothing to do with a death wish.
Really? No emotional recklessness at all?
None. He is not afraid because his confidence is not based on his own physical strength. His confidence is rooted in absolute certainty and objective truth. He understands the mechanics of the divine law, the social physics.
Okay.
He knows their system is already structurally compromised.
Okay, I really want to dig into that. He knows their building is condemned. Let's look at a modern parallel to make this concrete.
Let's do it.
Think about the 2008 financial crisis. Imagine a brilliant, solitary mathematician who has looked at the underlying data of the massive mortgage-backed securities that all the major banks were trading.
Right. The guy who actually had the fine print.
Exactly. He sees that they are entirely made of toxic, default-bound loans. So he stands before the corrupt board of directors of a trillion-dollar financial institution. They threaten him. They tell him they will ruin his career, drag his name through the mud, destroy his life.
The standard playbook.
But the mathematician just smiles. Because he knows 2 + 2 = 4. Their fraudulent accounting is going to crash their entire empire inevitably, no matter how many lawyers or, goons they hire to silence him. They cannot intimidate the math.
That is a phenomenal way to understand HUD's position. HUD is that mathematician. He isn't relying on his own ability to fight their army. He is relying on the objective laws of the universe to do the work.
Wow.
He is basically telling them, your threats are meaningless to me because your entire civilization is operating in direct violation of the fundamental laws of nature. You are already in a state of freefall. You just haven't hit the pavement yet.
And any compromise on his part would just be irrational at that point.
Precisely. You cannot negotiate a compromise with a system that is mathematically destined for collapse. If the mathematician agrees to sign off on a slightly less toxic, fraudulent spreadsheet, he just ties himself to the impending implosion.
He goes down with the ship.
Exactly. HUD refuses to compromise because participating in their system, even a little bit, guarantees his own destruction alongside theirs.
That is such a powerful perspective, and it really leads us into a linguistic detail in Ayat 56 that completely shifts how we understand the physics of human society here.
The forelock.
Yes. HUD explains exactly why he is so confident that their corrupt system will fail. He utters this incredibly profound phrase. There is no moving creature, but he holds it by its forelock.
The Arabic word used here is nasiya.
Right. And I really want to spend some time unpacking this concept of the forelock because this is where the physics truly applies to sociology in just a visceral way.
The linguistic depth of nasiya is absolutely crucial to understanding the mechanics of this universal law. The forelock is the hair on the front of the head, right above the forehead.
Like on a horse.
Exactly. In classical Arabic idiom, to be grabbed by the forelock means to be completely, inescapably, under someone's absolute control. It strips you of all autonomy.
Because where the head goes, the body follows.
Yes. Imagine a rider grabbing a wild, powerful horse by the forelock. No matter how much the horse thrashes or kicks, its head is controlled. The massive body must follow. It is forced to submit to the direction of the pull.
So the text is essentially saying that the ultimate law of the universe holds every creature, and by extension every society, by the forelock.
Yes. The Parwezian lens extrapolates this into this brilliant, overarching concept. This is the Quranic version of universal gravity. It's pure physics applied to sociology.
I love that. Pure physics applied to sociology.
Think about physical gravity. You cannot argue with gravity. You can't, hire a lobbyist to change the laws of gravity in your favor.
Right. You can't bribe gravity.
You can't bribe it, and you cannot build a military strong enough to shoot it down. If a nation violates the fundamental laws of social cohesion, equity, and justice, the universal law pulls the forelock, and the nation trips and collapses under its own weight.
Here's what I find so fascinating about this. Humans, especially humans, living in advanced, wealthy societies like the Ad, or frankly, our own modern societies today, we develop this massive collective ego.
Absolutely, hubris.
Total hubris. We build towering skyscrapers that pierce the clouds. We split the atom. We manipulate global markets in milliseconds. We literally fly to the moon.
And we start to think we're untouchable.
Right. Because of all this technological mastery, we start to think we are the masters of the universe. We think we have outgrown the basic rules, but ignoring these sociopolitical laws of equity is exactly like jumping off a 100-story building and trying to negotiate with the concrete on the way down.
And the concrete does not negotiate.
Nope.
And the universal law does not negotiate either. The Ad truly believed that their immense wealth, their architectural pillars, and their military might somehow insulated them from consequence.
They thought they were the exception.
They thought they had achieved escape velocity from the rules of human morality. But HUD is standing there reminding them that the forelock of their civilization is still firmly in the grip of cause and effect.
And the mechanism of that fall, it's not magical, it's structural.
Inherently structural. When a society becomes completely top-heavy with inequality, when the foundational base of the working class is crushed, starved, and exploited simply to support the bloated weight of the elite at the top, the center of gravity shifts.
It has to.
A building with a compromised foundation and a massive, heavy roof will collapse. The fall isn't a magical lightning bolt sent as punishment. It is a structural inevitability. The forelock is pulled by the sheer mechanics of their own greed.
Okay, but this brings up a massive paradigm-shifting question. If this law is pulling the forelock, what exactly is the nature of the entity or the system doing the pulling?
That's the big question.
Because historically, across almost all cultures, humanity has pictured God as a sort of capricious king in the sky.
Right, a monarch.
Yeah, an absolute monarch sitting on a throne who gets angry, throws a tantrum, tosses a lightning bolt, changes his mind, plays favorites, and demands constant flattery. If God is just a king with infinite power, does this sociopolitical gravity operate randomly based on his mood?
That question is actually the perfect bridge to the second half of Ayat 56. After mentioning the forelock, HUD immediately clarifies the nature of the pull.
What does he say?
He says, "Indeed, my Lord is on a straight path." In Arabic, in Rabbi al-Sirat al-Mustaqim. And within the framework we are utilizing today, this is arguably the most revolutionary concept in the entire narrative.
Walk me through why this is so revolutionary, because it sounds like a standard religious phrase.
It sounds standard, but it completely shatters that king in the sky archetype you just described. People usually think of God as an absolute monarch who can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, free from any constraints whatsoever.
Right, omnipotence without rules.
But this verse explicitly states that the sustainer himself operates according to a straight path, a consistent, unbending, non-arbitrary law.
Wait, meaning God is bound by his own laws.
Exactly. There are no mood swings in the divine system. The universe is not governed by a deity having a bad day or waking up on the wrong side of the bed.
That changes everything.
It does. It is governed by a consistent, unwavering, objective system of laws that apply equally to everyone, everywhere, at all times. This sustainer does not break the rules of cause and effect to play favorites.
The implications of that are just staggering. The straight path isn't just a set of nice moral suggestions for humans to follow. It is the operational framework of the cosmos itself.
And to really drive this home, the linguistic analysis of these texts provides a phenomenal breakdown of the word salat.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
Now, conventionally, in the modern world, salat is translated almost exclusively as ritual prayer. The physical act of bowing and prostrating.
Right, the 5 daily prayers.
But if we dig into the classical Arabic roots, we find a much deeper structural meaning. In ancient Arabia, horse racing was a major cultural touchstone.
Okay, horse racing.
In a race, the winning horse was called al-Sabiq. But the name given specifically to the second horse in the race was al-Musali.
The second horse. But wait, why would the fundamental religious concept of prayer be named after the runner-up? That seems backwards.
Because of what the second horse does.
Yeah.
Al-Musali wasn't just any horse that happened to come in second. It was the horse whose head was positioned right at the tail of the leading horse.
Oh, wow.
It follows the path of the leader flawlessly. It doesn't deviate to the left. It doesn't deviate to the right. It doesn't lag behind. And it doesn't try to forge its own random path. It maintains perfect, continuous, unyielding alignment with the leader's trajectory.
Okay, that is an incredible image. The horse tracking the path without an inch of deviation.
Therefore, establishing salat, or ikamat as-salat, means far more than just periodic physical postures in a designated building. It means to closely, continuously, and flawlessly track the consistent laws of the divine system in every single breath of life.
It's an act of alignment.
Exactly. It means aligning your societal structures, your economics, and your justice system perfectly with the objective laws of the universe. Just as the second horse perfectly tracks the first, human society is meant to track the straight path of universal law.
Okay, I love the elegance of that, but I am going to push back heavily on this because let's look at reality.
Okay, bring it on.
If there is this one objective straight path, this one perfect mathematical law of how a healthy society functions, why is human history just a complete bloodbath of competing dogmas?
That's a fair question.
The analysis we are looking at even mentions the traditional idea that the religious community will fracture into 73 sects. We have thousands of religions, countless political parties, contradictory economic theories, and every single one of them claims with absolute certainty that they are the ones on the straight path.
Everyone thinks they are right.
Yes. So how do we reconcile this beautiful, elegant idea of a single unifying social physics with the reality of absolute sectarian chaos and subjective human experience?
It is a critical contradiction to address. But the Parwezian framework actually neutralizes this sectarian debate by pointing right back to the core assertion. The straight path is singular, objective, and universal. It is not an arbitrary religious label.
So it's not about what team you're on.
No, it is an objective system of living based on equity, justice, and the equitable distribution of resources.
So the labels are entirely irrelevant to the physics.
More than irrelevant, the labels are often the very proof that a group has abandoned the path. The framework argues that the moment people invent sectarian labels, when they divide themselves into competing religious or political factions, each claiming a monopoly on salvation, each excommunicating or demonizing the other, they have automatically stepped off the straight path of natural law.
Because they've created divisions.
Right. Sectarianism at its core is essentially the worship of one's own group identity.
I see. So if you are operating a society that starves the poor and protects the billionaires, it literally doesn't matter if you call yourselves Muslims, Christians, capitalists, communists, or anything else. You are violating the objective law.
Exactly. The straight path isn't about what you call yourself or what flag you fly. It's about whether your societal math adds up to justice. If you are hoarding wealth while the base of your society suffers, gravity is going to pull your forelock.
Your label will not save you from the concrete.
Not at all.
So if a society does abandon this straight path, if they get off the track, ignore the mathematical realities of equity, and start hoarding wealth and exploiting vulnerable populations, what is the universe's immune response?
How does the system purge the infection?
Exactly. And that brings us to Ayat 57, and arguably the most sobering, maybe even terrifying concept in this entire exploration, the engine of reason, or evolutionary replacement theory.
This is where the narrative shifts from diagnosis to prognosis. Hud warns his people, the Ad. He essentially tells them, if you turn away from this straight path, my Lord will replace you with another people, and you cannot harm him at all.
Now, on the surface, reading that in a traditional mindset, I immediately think, okay, classic ancient divine threat, obey me or I will smite you and give your fertile land to someone else.
Right, it sounds very wrathful.
It sounds like fear-mongering from an angry deity.
It does sound like that if you use the king in the sky paradigm. But the analytical lens we are using is very firm on this point. It is not an emotional threat. It is an evolutionary necessity.
Evolutionary necessity.
The concept in Arabic is istiqla fil ard, which translates to succession or replacement in the earth. The universe operates on a fundamental, uncompromising economy of value. A system, a nation, or a civilization that does not produce value for humanity at large, or one that hoards its resources for a select few, is eventually and inevitably recycled by history.
Recycled by history. That is a brutal way to phrase it, but it paints a very clear picture.
It is the socio-historical equivalent of Darwinian evolution. Nature abhors a vacuum, but it also abhors stagnation.
Right.
If a biological species cannot adapt, if it consumes resources without contributing to the ecological balance, it goes extinct. It is replaced by a species that can function within the ecosystem. The social physics we are discussing applies this exact law to civilizations.
So if a nation loses its utility...
If it loses its utility to human progress, if its economy falters because of internal hoarding and injustice, it loses its standing. It becomes weak from the inside out, its institutions rot, and it eventually becomes subservient to another nation that steps in to replace it on the global stage.
To make this incredibly concrete, the framework connects this concept of evolutionary replacement to a very specific economic principle called infaq. I want to unpack the mechanics of infaq because it perfectly illustrates the difference between a society that survives the evolutionary filter and one that gets recycled.
Infaq is the absolute cornerstone of this economic philosophy. To understand it, we have to look at the linguistic root of the word, which comes from nafaq. Nafaq literally means a tunnel or a passage. Crucially, it means something that is open at both ends.
Open at both ends. So it is the exact opposite of a vault or a safe or, a billionaire's offshore bank account.
Precisely. Infaq represents wealth and resources flowing like a continuous spring. Wealth enters the society through production or natural resources, and it must continually flow out to nourish the society, satisfying the needs of the populace.
Constant circulation.
Yes. Contrast this with the typical capitalist or feudal hoarding mentality, where wealth flows up to the elites and is stored in closed pouches. It becomes stagnant.
And what happens mechanically when wealth becomes stagnant like that?
Well, when wealth is monopolized, when it stops flowing to satisfy basic human needs, the structural integrity of that society begins to weaken rapidly. The base of the society starves. They lack education, healthcare, infrastructure, basic stability.
While the top gets richer.
Meanwhile, the elite at the top become bloated, disconnected, and inefficient. The society rots from within because the lifeblood of the economy is no longer circulating.
It's like a human body where all the blood pools in the head and refuses to circulate to the limbs.
That's a great analogy.
The limbs will become necrotic, and eventually the entire body is going to die. Economic hoarding isn't just a moral failing, it is a structural, fatal flaw.
Absolutely.
And when that society dies from economic necrosis, the universal law that evolutionary necessity dictates that a new society will move in to replace it. The ad thought their military made them irreplaceable. HUD is telling them the universe does not need you. You are not essential. If you do not provide value and maintain flow, you will simply be swapped out for a system that does.
And notice the end of that verse. You cannot harm him at all. Meaning, their defiance and their hoarding doesn't hurt the objective laws of the universe.
Gravity isn't offended if you fall.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The universe isn't weeping over their collapse. It will simply continue its evolutionary march forward with a different group of people.
Okay, so economic injustice, hoarding, and stopping the flow of infaq trigger this replacement. But there is another massive trigger for a civilization's downfall that we really need to explore. It's what happens when a nation loses its fundamental humanity and refuses to protect the vulnerable.
Yes, this brings us to the mechanism of survival, which is deeply centered around the defense of the oppressed. And this is where the historical analysis we're looking at tackles some incredibly weighty and controversial concepts.
Right.
Specifically, it redefines the true concept of jihad as an active, mandatory mechanism of the divine law.
Now, obviously, this is a topic with immense historical baggage, and the perspective we are unpacking makes some very specific historical claims about how this concept has been manipulated. The source material mentions major historical conflicts like the Crusades. It discusses the actions of the British East India Company, the use of the Wahhabi label, and even touches on theological shifts within groups like the Qadiani movement. We are going to explore these just to understand the central thesis about self-defense and anti-imperialism.
And the central thesis being presented by the author here is this. If an oppressive empire is actively crushing people, the divine law doesn't operate by dropping magic lightning bolts from the sky to save them.
The universe requires human agents to stand up.
Exactly. Justice is not a passive energy field. It requires physical intervention.
Right. It demands human hands to enforce the math.
Exactly. True jihad, in its original Quranic context, as analyzed here, is not an aggressive war of imperial expansion. It is not about forcing religion on people at the point of a sword.
Which is the common misconception.
Right. Rather, it is the active mechanism required by the law of social physics to stop tyrants. If a society sees oppression happening, whether inside its borders or outside, and does nothing, that society is complicit in the violation of the universal law.
And it invites its own destruction.
Yes.
This analysis provides a really fascinating, somewhat subversive perspective on how this concept of active resistance has been viewed by imperial powers throughout history. The argument is essentially that empires are absolutely terrified of a theology that mandates physical resistance to tyranny.
They are terrified of it because it makes the populace ungovernable by unjust means. The author frames several historical events through this lens of imperial anxiety. For instance, looking at the Crusades, the argument is that centuries of encountering a civilization that believed it was a divine duty to fight back against foreign incursion instilled a deep generational fear in European powers.
And how did that fear manifest during, say, the era of modern colonization? Let's talk about the British Empire in India.
Well, according to the text, during the colonization of the Indian subcontinent, the British East India Company and later the British Crown were deeply anxious about the revolutionary potential of this concept of jihad.
They knew it was a threat to their control.
They realized they couldn't just conquer the land physically. They had to pacify the theology. The analysis argues that the British deliberately engaged in a massive PR campaign. They took indigenous freedom fighters who were resisting colonial rule and labeled them as Wahhabis.
Why that specific label, though?
Because it allowed the British to discredit the resistance. By labeling them as dangerous fringe religious zealots rather than legitimate freedom fighters defending their homeland, the British could isolate them politically from the rest of the population.
I see.
They turned a duty of self-defense into a marker of extremism.
They colonized the narrative to protect their supply lines. And the analysis goes even further, suggesting that empires will actively support theological movements that pacify the population.
Yes. The historical view presented here contends that movements like the Qadiani sect, also known as the Ahmadiyya movement, are deeply beneficial to the British Empire.
How so?
The founder of this movement allegedly abrogated the concept of physical jihad. From the perspective of the colonizers, a theological shift that says you no longer need to physically fight the oppressive empire ruling over you is a massive victory.
Because it pacifies resistance.
It appeases the colonizers entirely. Whether intentionally designed for this or not, the analysis points out that empires will always champion theology that demands passivity from the oppressed.
Stripping away the historical controversies for a moment, the core philosophical point here is profound. The universe demands action.
It does.
Passive thoughts and prayers are structurally useless against a tank or an exploitative supply chain. To illustrate this demand for action, there is a beautifully poignant anecdote in the text about Muhammad bin Qasim. I want to spend some time on this story because it perfectly captures this idea of human agency acting as the literal hands of the divine law.
It is a powerful historical narrative that illustrates the concept perfectly. The story goes that an oppressed Muslim girl in the region of Sindh, which is in modern-day Pakistan, was captured by pirates or a tyrannical local ruler.
Okay.
She was completely isolated, imprisoned, and far away from the center of the Islamic Caliphate in the Middle East. She didn't know where the Caliph was. She didn't know if he could even hear her. But she cried out for help. She prayed for rescue.
And what is the mechanism of the answer to that prayer?
The response didn't come in the form of a sudden, miraculous earthquake that swallowed her captors. It didn't come as a flock of birds dropping stones. The response came because the news of her cry eventually reached the caliphate, and the society recognized it as their absolute, unbending duty to act.
They didn't just send well wishes.
No, they mobilized. They sent a massive army led by the young general Muhammad bin Qasim to march all the way across brutal terrain to Sindh for the express purpose of rescuing her and dismantling the oppressive system that held her.
But isn't that a contradiction? Let me play devil's advocate for a second here. If the universal law is objective, like gravity, why does it need human hands to enforce it? Gravity doesn't need me to walk over and pull an apple down from the tree. The apple just falls. If tyrants are doomed by social physics, why do we have to march an army across a desert to stop them?
That is a brilliant question, and it really strikes at the heart of social physics. The gravity of human society is predicated on human agency.
Explain that.
An apple falls because it has mass. A tyrant falls because the collective mass of human resistance pulls him down. Human beings are the physical particles through which social gravity operates. The analysis highlights that God's help comes through the agency of people who are willing to stand up for the weak.
So we are the mechanism.
Exactly. It is the fundamental responsibility of a healthy society to act as the hands of justice. If a society hears the cry of the oppressed, whether it's a girl imprisoned in Sindh or exploited factory workers in a modern supply chain, or a marginalized community being crushed by debt and they do nothing, they lose their right to exist.
Oh.
The universe registers them as useless. They will be swept away by that evolutionary replacement we talked about earlier.
That completely obliterates the modern passive thoughts and prayers mentality. You cannot just send positive vibes to the oppressed while you sit back in comfort and watch the tyrant operate.
No, you can't.
The universe demands physical, structural action. If you don't provide the action, you are violating the straight path, and you will eventually fall.
Which brings us to the ultimate climax of the ad narrative. What actually happened to this magnificent, towering civilization when they refused to listen to HUD, hoarded their wealth, and ignored the structural laws of justice?
We find the conclusion in Ayats 58 through 60. The verses describe how HUD and the small group of people who stood with him were saved by a special mercy from a severe penalty, while the mighty empire of Ad was completely, violently destroyed.
And the text doesn't just say they were destroyed. It dives into the specific anatomy of their crimes, detailing the exact sequence of their ruin in Ayat 59. It lists 3 progressive fatal steps.
Walk me through the anatomy of their collapse. What was step 1?
Step 1. They rejected the signs of their Lord. In the Parwezian framework, this means they ignored the objective evidence. They ignored the mathematical realities of their socioeconomic imbalance. They saw the poverty, they saw the exploitation, and they chose to look away.
Willful ignorance of the data.
Exactly. Step 2. They disobeyed his messengers. This means they didn't just passively ignore the data, they actively fought against the reformers who were trying to course-correct the society.
HUD.
Right. They gaslit HUD, they threatened him, and they tried to silence the alarm bells.
See, if I'm looking at the anatomy of societal decay, rejecting the math and fighting the reformers is bad enough. But a society can limp along in denial for a long time. There has to be a catalyst that finally pushes them over the edge into total, irreversible collapse. What is the third step?
The third and final step is the catalyst. They follow the command of every obstinate tyrant. The Arabic phrase used is Jabbarin Anid. Let's break that down. Jabbar implies someone who uses brute force, coercion, and violence to compel others to submit to their will. It is a dictator.
And in need.
A need means someone who is stubbornly, blindly opposed to the truth, even when the truth is staring them right in the face. It is an arrogant refusal to change course no matter what the data says.
So blind obedience to toxic, stubborn leadership is the final accelerant of decay. The citizens of Ad didn't just passively let their system fail. Out of fear of losing their status, they actively rallied behind the most brutal, arrogant leaders who promised to maintain the status quo at any cost.
That's the tragic irony of it.
They hitched their wagon to dictators who promised them greatness while driving them straight off a cliff.
Precisely. By handing their autonomy over to Jabbar and Anid, they sealed their fate. The structural collapse was imminent. And Ayat 60 concludes this tragic sequence by stating that a curse followed them in this world and on the day of judgment.
Now, earlier we stripped away the supernatural elements. So within this framework, what exactly is this curse? It's not a magical spell muttered by a wizard.
No, it is not a magical hex. In the Parwezian framework, a curse, lana, means to be deprived of mercy, to be entirely cut off from the flow of universal progress and development.
Oh, I see.
The curse is the lingering, toxic legacy of their own arrogance. It is the natural consequence of building a society so entirely misaligned with the laws of nature that history itself rejects you. Their society becomes a permanent cautionary tale.
Their ruins serve as a permanent historical warning. They built towering architectural pillars that they honestly thought would last forever, but because the foundation was fundamentally rotten with inequality, because they hoarded wealth and followed stubborn tyrants, the universe simply pulled their forelock.
It did.
They tripped, they fell, and the literal sands of time swallowed their empire.
It is a stark, unavoidable reminder that absolutely no amount of technological advancement, military might, or economic hoarding can save a civilization that defies the basic laws of human equity. You can delay the consequences, but the social physics always balances the equation in the end.
Gravity always wins.
Gravity always wins.
So we leave the pillars of Ad crumbling in the desert, a testament to the hubris of empire. But the engine of history doesn't stop turning. The evolutionary replacement cycle keeps moving forward. And this brings us to a teaser for the next part of our journey.
I'm looking forward to it.
As we move into the next set of lectures in this analysis, covering Ayats 61 to 68, we travel from the sandy ruins of Ad to the rocky, mountainous terrain of an entirely new civilization, Thamud.
And with a new civilization comes a new reformer and a completely new test of social physics. Prophet Salih arrives to confront the elites of Thamud. But this time, the conflict takes on a very specific, tangible form.
Right. Salih brings them a specific economic challenge involving a she-camel in Arabic, the Nakatullah, the camel of God. Now, we are not going to dive into the mechanics of that today, but based on the framework we established over the last hour, I want you to start pondering this question.
It's a big one.
In a text that uses deep, profound socioeconomic metaphors, where idols represent corporate monopolies and the forelock represents the inescapable gravity of cause and effect, is the she-camel just a literal magical animal walking around eating grass? Or is it something more?
Or is the she-camel a profound symbol for public resources, water rights, and the equitable distribution of a nation's wealth?
Given how we've unpacked the Ad narrative, the she-camel is going to present a fascinating, high-stakes test case for how a society handles its shared natural resources. Will they allow the resources to flow, practicing infaq, or will they try to hoard the camel for themselves?
We will leave that massive question for our next deep dive, but as we wrap up today, I want to circle back to the image we started with. We talked about diagnosing a society. We talked about looking at history not as a series of random events, but as an X-ray of structural integrity.
We have seen how the elites of Ad tried to gaslight their reformer by calling him insane. We saw how they genuinely believed their immense wealth made them immune to the laws of nature. And we saw how the universe inevitably pulled them down by the forelock.
They believed they had achieved escape velocity from consequence.
Yeah.
But they forgot about the straight path.
Exactly. So here is a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your week. Take a step back from the daily grind and really look around at the systems you participate in right now.
The ones we take for granted.
Yeah. Look at your workplace hierarchy. Look at your local economy. Look at our national politics and our global supply chains. Ask yourself, are these systems operating on a straight path that produces universal value, maintains the flow of resources, and fiercely protects the vulnerable? Or are they structured exactly like the Ad? Are we participating in systems that hoard wealth at the top, exploit the working base to elevate a few untouchable elites, and dismiss anyone who points out the structural math as crazy or radical? Are we building a society that actually aligns with natural law? Or are we just defying social gravity, building our towers higher and higher, blindly waiting for the universe to grab us by the forelock?
It is the ultimate test of evolutionary survival, and it's a question every single civilization has to answer eventually.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.